Hello and welcome. Today I'll be taking a look at the latest trailer that just went live for The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. This is such an interesting trailer that focuses on traversal, and we see a lot of new details here. I will be approaching this video not as a fan of Zelda and not as a gamer, but as a commercial games developer. I am Jerrel. I run a games development studio and I create commercial games, but I also create free homebrew games as well. So I'll be sharing my analysis and pointing out some things that I really like, some things I find impressive, and some things I find interesting. I have a couple concerns in terms of some minor errors that we see here and there, and I'll be explaining those things. So this video is primarily for people who are interested in these kinds of behind the scenes sort of information behind things that they like. And for anyone that is interested in getting into game development, this video might be interesting to you as I'll be sharing my insight and experience as a developer. Frankly, I think this is a little bit of a flex, showing this much of the world map and showing, look at all of this that you get to explore. I find this interesting. It indicates that there likely won't be any loading between the various areas of the game, which sounds very cool, but it's going to introduce some issues and problems, and I will explain that later in the video. Something I find interesting is the grass objects are drawn even from a very far distance, so they aren't culling them until they are very far away. I think the grass is culled after this point. Right there, you don't see any more grass drawn. And it's important to draw grass at that distance because if they did not do that, the scenes would look quite plain. So that was a very good decision in terms of art direction. Obviously, other smaller objects are not going to be drawn. They are culled at that distance. And the reason why they do that is because the more objects that the game has to render, the slower the game will run, the more it uses up the graphical budget, the rendering budget. So you want to optimize the game. So something that I find very interesting, this is something that I really respect here, is that the graphics on the towers for the castle use a combination of normal maps and 3D models to create a sense of depth and imperfection. A normal map is an image that a game uses to help an object have a sense of detail and depth. Because this object uses a normal map, you can see that it is able to catch the light, so it seems like it's sticking out there and it's receding there and catching the shadows. That detail is not actually part of the 3D model. That comes in from the normal map. And the reason why games do that is because the more polygonal data you have on a model, the more expensive it becomes to render. So they use a normal map, but normal maps have their own cost to rendering. So they use a combination of normal maps and 3D modeling. As you can see here, that is part of a 3D model. You also see that here on the roof as well. And I think it's very well done. It gives it a sense that this world is lived in. There's a sense of imperfection, and it makes it interesting to look at. Now at 38, there's something, unfortunately, we're going to see. It's quite subtle, but you'll see, if you can notice, as Zelda approaches, this area here is a little bit of frame stuttering. Now it's quite subtle here, but I will point out later in the video areas where it's significantly more noticeable, so I will explain that later. Now, I'm sure some people are going to leave negative comments and say that I'm nitpicking, but again, I am not approaching this video as a gamer, nor am I approaching it as a fan or a YouTuber. I'm not a YouTuber. My job is to create video games, so I have to understand things like this so I can make games for you guys that are the best that they can be. So this is not a nitpick, this is a technical explanation. And I'll touch on that detail a little bit more later. And again, it's at the end of the day, even if that is in the end product, it's not really going to be that big of a deal because I'm certain the developers have done the absolute best that they can. So something that I find interesting here is one of the first examples that the creation of echoes is totally grid-based. It is locked to a grid, and you see Zelda pushed back a little bit from that. So this is not a flaw. I respect the developers for maintaining that grid-based system. But what this tells me is that there's probably a pretty good chance that people will be able to use that to aid with speed runs, to sort of glitch through walls and break boundaries and get into areas that they shouldn't be accessing so early in the game. So what impresses me about this is the developers understand this, and they would have had to create the entire environment of the game knowing that, and creating all of the geometry, placing all of the objects in a way that avoids the player being able to glitch through walls and other objects. So at 53 here, I'm just going to passion out a little bit here and explain some visual effects that I really like. This fire looks so fantastic, and I have so much respect when I see things in games and I just can't figure out how I would implement that myself. You could do that by frame animating, which would be very time consuming and also just use up a ton of memory that isn't necessary. So that effect I think is so fantastic, and something here I really admire is the effect of the Tektite jumping up out of the water. You'll see a little column of water leap up as if the water tension is following him up out of the water. I really like that effect. Very neat. And of course he comes down with a little splash that's just quite neat. I like this scene here that depicts that there is going to be some sense of diving and exploration underwater, as we see multiple stages of depth underwater. And of course, very good game design that we expect from Zelda is the game shows the player something that the player wants, but the player is not yet able to access, letting the player know organically that they will be able to explore this area later on. There is something that I want to point out here that's such a small, fine detail. It's not even that noticeable. It's this sort of geometry here that you see is sort of bumpy and has imperfections. The artist could have just made it straight lines. It would have been a little bit faster, but not that much. It doesn't take that long to add this sort of bumpiness and detail, and it follows a design philosophy I call breaking the line, where if you have a game that's all just straight lines, it's not interesting, it doesn't feel organic, but by breaking the line is what they've done here and added just a little bit of bumpiness. It gives it a sense of organic appeal to, and it makes it look like this real lived-in world that's just visually more interesting to look at. At 108, something I noticed here is the butterflies cast shadows. I just thought it was a fun little thing to notice for me, because in my head it makes me think these are some massive honkin' butterflies if they're casting shadows like that. Something that I really respect here, and I might probably go on a little bit too long about this, is the way that they've implemented the terrain grass. Now, what's the most common way to implement terrain grass in games is to just paint the grass onto the terrain. But what I've noticed here by taking a close look is that this is actually actual physical 3D model that is placed over the terrain. You can see the rocks clipping over the grass a little bit, and if the grass was painted on, you can bet that that grass would be covering over those rocks, which is a little bit of a giveaway. This isn't a flaw or critique, it's just something that I've noticed that is a little bit of a giveaway, that the grass is a 3D model, that this portion of rocks itself is a 3D model that's gone on top of that. To where you can see, again, that is a 3D model pasted over the terrain, and this is something that I have a lot of respect for, because if I were to be given this task to create whatever system they use that has tiles and able to go over the terrain like that, I don't know where I would begin. And so it would be a logistical challenge to implement something like that. So I have a lot of respect to the developers for implementing the grass in that way. So very interesting. And this is the perfect giveaway that the grass is a 3D model, because you can see the grass extending over the edges there and also going over onto the bridge. If it was painted on, you certainly would not be able to do that. I'll come back to the scene in a little bit as well. Unfortunately, we are going to see a little bit of stuttering, and I'll just explain that pretty quickly here. Did you see it? So just there, we get some frame stuttering. And unfortunately, we see this quite a few times in the trailer. And again, this is not a nitpick. This is not a review. This is not a reaction video. This is pointing out just something that's part of the game. Now, I believe the reason why this is happening is not because of the graphics. It's not because of visual effects, because this scene is not the kind of scene that is graphically demanding. This is actually not that complex to draw. Now, I believe the reason why the game is stuttering in places like this is because the game is actually loading in graphical assets as the player is playing. As we saw, there doesn't appear to be loading screens in between areas, most likely. So that means that as the player is approaching different areas, the game will try to seamlessly load in assets for things like bushes, trees, other kinds of particle effects, sound effects, enemies. And even on strong hardware, it can be noticeable, but the Switch, unfortunately, when the switch has to load in assets like that, it does stutter. I've developed a number of Switch games, and this is an issue that I have faced with my development as well. So what's happening here is that the game is loading in assets as the player is approaching that area. Unfortunately, the only solution to this would be to load all of those assets in ahead of time, and the developers may be in a position where there just is not enough RAM left. Because it is inconsistent, you only see it for a moment. That is what leads me to believe that is not occurring because of a graphically demanding scene. Now, if we have a look at this scene here, this is a scene that I just admire. There are so many small, fine details here that are blink and you miss it, and you wouldn't really notice it, but they really do add so much to the overall experience. It is small details like the cracks in the building just here. It is the combined use of using 3D modeling with the bricks that stick out with the normal mapping. And you have these imperfections, it's chipped away on the corners here or on the edges. It's small details like this that subconsciously help someone believe that this is a lived-in world with imperfections, that it's not just this, a product of polygons and colors on the screen. And it takes a lot of work to be able to convince the player to sort of suspend their disbelief further and further and feel like they do want to be a part of this world that is totally made up. Now, at this scene here, we will see an interesting poster that shows Zelda's face. You see this a couple times throughout the trailer, but if I zoom in on that photo there, you'll notice this fine detail that isn't actually a poster of Zelda. They actually just used the wanted poster of Sanji from One Piece, and I really respect the developers paying homage to One Piece in that way. It's such a great story and a great anime and manga, so it's great to see that homage there. At 2:30, we have a look at the map here, and we see that the map is split up into chunks. Not only does this make sense from a gameplay standpoint for the player, it makes sense, but as a developer, it makes it a lot easier to implement a system where portions of the map are revealed. As a developer, I'm getting a little bit of optimization anxiety because I look at these are actually high. These textures are actually quite high resolution. You have the tiles that are underneath, and then you have these high resolution pictures. And because this has to be viewable and loaded into memory at absolutely any time during the game, because the player can open this and view it at any time, this is basically space in RAM that's basically going to be permanently taken up. And it just gives me anxiety as a developer to think, because this isn't all, we have significantly more, there's more details, it's a high resolution image. The trees are slanted back and the grass is tilted so it's facing upwards towards the camera. And the reason why they do that is so that it helps recreate the look of isometric 2D games. This technique was implemented in A Link Between Worlds and also the Link's Awakening remake. You'll see that the trees would look fine if they were not tilted, and the grass would look a little bit more paper thin if they weren't leaned back, which means that the developers would have to implement more grass. So this is a way to have the grass look interesting and take up more space while looking convincing. It's a very good solution. Hi there, it's me. I'm Jerrel. I'm a normal human being, and I make games for a living. I'm the one that's been talking. So a lot of people have been asking me, what games have you made? And who are you? So this is me. I'm not a YouTuber. I don't know how to be interesting or funny on camera, so I think I'll just use my Zelda cosplay. So this is my Zelda Echoes of Wisdom cosplay, and I just wanted to share with you, if you are interested in checking out a game that I've done recently, my latest game is available on the Nintendo Switch eShop right now. It's called Clash Your Ball. It's an action puzzle game with a color matching sort of gameplay, but there are tons of different unique hazards and gameplay gimmicks that keep things interesting. So if you're interested in checking that out, it is on sale right now. Okay, I have some fan games coming up as well, some homebrew games, some cool stuff that's unofficial, that's not related to my official work. I'll put the link in the description if you would like to check out my homebrew games, but I'm making also some fan games. Again, they're totally free, not monetized in any way. They're just a cool way to hang out with you guys and chat, and we can hang out on my live streams. You can check out ideas. We can just throw them all in a blender into homebrew games and just make some fun stuff. All right, okay, back to the video. Here again, you'll see another example of some frame stuttering. You'll see the horse will hiccup just there and there. Again, this is most likely due to the game loading in assets, streaming in assets in real time. You see the horse hiccup there. The only real way to alleviate that is to just load more objects in memory and keep them in memory as opposed to releasing them and loading in stuff so actively. They could probably just adjust that so the stutters happen less, but it's most likely going to stay there because, again, there is a limited budget for keeping assets in memory. This is just an interesting detail I noticed, is that when Zelda hops up onto the horse, she loses her blob shadow and she gains a real-time shadow. Again, it's not a critique or criticism. I just think it's an interesting little detail. I want to pause here to point out something that I really like, and that is this nice lighting on this building here. Now, literally, and in terms of realism, this makes no sense why this is so bright and the rest of the building is so dark back there, but that's not the point. Video games are not about literalism and realism. They're about visual expression and visual communication. And what this is doing, and does extremely well, is it visually communicates to the player in an interesting way. This is the entrance, this is the opening of the building, and this is where light is coming in. It does this in such an elegant and interesting way, and I just really respect the art here. It's so interesting. It's disappointing seeing more and more games come out where the developers are focusing on realism and literalism, and it makes for a much less engaging and interesting experience, where something like this is that's so interesting to see from an artistic standpoint, and it does it way better than just having it look literally realistic. So I really respect that. It's so neat to see. On this screen, we can see some items that help the player dive deeper, jump higher, again, a focus on traversal. What caught my eye is space for clothing. There appear to be only 4 slots for outfits. I'm not that concerned because I've already got my cosplay for Incognito Zelda, but I think in-game I'll be using the horse riding outfit, or whatever that's going to be called. If we pause at 334, we'll notice an error here. This tiling is apparent because you can see these white seams here. Now, the reason why that has occurred is because whoever was creating this image had a larger image. They would have had this is the single image, and it would have been higher resolution. So they reduced the size, they've scaled it down, and then they've just copied and pasted it a bunch of times. But the problem with doing that is imaging programs will soften and blend the pixels so that they look nice when they are scaled down, but they also blend the opacity of the image. So the edges, which used to be hard edges, are now soft, and by putting them next to each other, you will see a seam. The color that is showing through is either the transparency that is in that image, or it's a white background. An easy way to solve this would be to sample one of these colors, go to a layer that is underneath this image, and then just fill that layer with that color, and then this would not be apparent. This isn't a nitpick. I thought it would just be funny to point things like this out. I've worked for years and years, oh no, decades at this point, I'm quite old, in marketing and advertising, video editing, especially when it comes to creating posters and marketing banners. So you tend to catch on to things like this when it's a part of your work. You just have an attention to detail and an eye for things like that. Obviously, this is not a complaint. I'm pointing it out to be funny, I think. At 405, we see the first example of try being selectable on the heads-up display with the X button. Some interesting detail I notice is that some echoes cast a real-time shadow and some have a blob shadow. This echo has a real-time shadow. This echo has a blob shadow. This echo has a real-time shadow. This echo has a blob shadow. This isn't a nitpick or a complaint. I'm just interested to know and understand what is the distinction between echoes that get a blob shadow and which get a real-time shadow. Perhaps it has to do with traversal and accurately spacing the player's movements. So, in summary, I think this is a great trailer. I'm very much looking forward to this game. It's very interesting looking. The flying and the climbing on echo creatures really blurs the line between 2D and 3D style games, because this isn't just a 2D style Zelda game. There is traversal and exploration through verticality now as well, which wasn't really part of the 2D formula for Zelda games. There are potential performance implications because of loading assets in real time. I really hope the developers are able to alleviate that a bit so it's an overall better experience for players. The game seems to be rendering at a lower internal resolution, and when I say that, I mean the camera that is viewing the 3D world is actually a lower resolution. And I can tell that because the heads-up display is not at the same level of pixel density. That's high resolution, that's 1080, whereas internally you can see the pixels a little bit more. I'm sure they'll implement some form of anti-aliasing or aliasing, however, which way you swing. And I'm sure they'll keep improving the end product by the end of it. But again, that's not a flaw. I just noticed that they are rendering at a lower internal resolution, which to me tells me that they are considering all of the performance implications of their visuals. So I just think that's neat. So I'm very much looking forward to this. Thank you so much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting and useful to you. And I just, again, want to thank my patrons so much. Because of you guys, I'm able to keep developing games. You help me keep the light on in the studio. And when I have a month of good sales, because of the patrons, I am able to spend time making free homebrew games for you guys. And that's just fun stuff that we can talk about and hang out. I can make games for old consoles. You guys get to recommend if you want a game on a specific old consoles. Someone once asked for making a game on the Pokemon Mini, and I did. I made a Pokemon Mini, so I always enjoy hanging out with you guys and just, you know, not just talking about games, but stuff in general. So thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. I've got some cool new videos coming up with more analyses, and I'm working on my next commercial game to launch, which will be launching later this year, and more homebrew games. Take care of yourselves, everyone.